Good evening, and welcome to the 2015 annual James A. Kirk Lecture, sponsored by the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Denver. And welcome to the Anderson Academic Commons. We're glad you found it. This has become our preferred venue for this event, and we're pleased that you've been able to join us. My name is Gregory Robbins, and I'm chairman of the Department of Religious Studies. The James A. Kirk Lectureship is the product of an initiative taken by faculty members in the Department of Religious Studies in the mid-1990s. In responding to the university's capital campaign efforts at that time, we chose to raise funds for the purpose of honoring one of the founding members and former chairs of our department. James Kirk began his career at DU as a part-time faculty member in 1956, while he was pursuing the THD at the Iliff School of Theology. He accepted a full-time faculty appointment in 1959. Upon his retirement, the Board of Trustees voted to award him the rank of Professor Emeritus. Jim and his wife Lois repaired to the Oregon coast, where they took great delight in hosting children, grandchildren, and vacationing former colleagues. We were saddened to learn of Professor Kirk's death on November the 23rd, 2013. Because of Professor Kirk's comparative interests and pioneering involvement in interreligious dialogue, the goal in establishing the lectureship was to foster greater understanding of the important role religion plays in the world and in American civic life and discourse. The inaugural lecture, April 30th, 1998, was delivered by Gustav Niebuhr, a leading journalist and writer about religious pluralism and interfaith relations in America, and who for many years occupied the religion desk at the New York Times. He contributed regular commentaries to National Public Radio's daily news magazine, All Things Considered. This year, then, marks the 18th in a truly distinguished series that continues to enhance the university's mission and its dedication to the public good. The Kirk Lectures, both by the prestige of the speakers invited and by the timeliness of their topics, serve also to raise the profile of our department and its faculty, whose research and publication, classroom teaching, and service to the community seek to enrich our thinking and conversation about religion in the public square. The Department of Religious Studies has changed a great deal in the years since Jim's retirement. With 8 faculty members, we've doubled in size since the mid-1980s. We are a diverse and active bunch of scholar teachers. This evening, I would like to acknowledge Professor Carl Raschke, whom James Kirk hired fresh out of graduate school at Harvard. He's now the senior member of our department, entering his 43rd year. Dr. Raschke is a philosopher of religion who serves as our director of graduate studies. Dr. Sandra Lee Dixon, associate professor, specializes in psychology of religion, especially religion and psychobiography. Our colleague Ginny Ishimatsu is associate professor, whose area of focus is Hindu studies and who is director of the Asian Studies program at DU. Dr. Allison Schofield is associate professor who does groundbreaking work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, who holds an appointment as well in DU's Center for Judaic Studies. Andrea Stanton, who is assistant professor of Islamic studies and director of our undergraduate studies program, is not able to be with us this evening because she is nursing a sick infant, but sends her greetings. And our newest faculty member is Benjamin Norse, who joins us as a postdoctoral fellow in Buddhist studies, having completed his PhD in 2014 at the University of Virginia. I have not yet mentioned my esteemed colleague, Dr. Luís León, who specializes in the history of religions in the Americas, whose second book, The Political Spirituality of Cesar Chavez, has just been published by the University of California Press. And it was Professor León who championed the nomination of our 2015 James A. Kirk Lecturer, Professor Anthea Butler. I turn to him to provide the introduction to her and to her lecture this evening.
Thank you, and welcome to DU, Department of Religious Studies. Thank you, Greg. Thank you all for coming out. It's a genuine privilege to introduce Professor Anthea Butler, particularly because she's extraordinarily busy as a highly sought-after public speaker and television presence, particularly on MSNBC's Melissa Harris Perry show, among other broadcasts. Yet she graciously agreed to work DU into her schedule, in part because she wanted to visit family in the area, and also in part because, as she put it, she liked me. And I have to say that the feeling is mutual. I like her too, very much. Professor Butler is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and Graduate Chair of Religious Studies. She holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University in Religion, a Master's in Religion from Vanderbilt, and a Master's in Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. A historian of American and African American religion, Professor Butler's research and writing spans religion and politics, religion and gender, African American religions, sexuality, and religion and popular culture. Professor Butler's forthcoming book, The Gospel According to Sarah Palin, explores the role of religion in Sarah Palin's political action and Palin's influence on the Republican Party. And we got her to speak about that at dinner and on the car ride over here, and it sounds really fascinating. So this is, Sarah Palin is a very interesting person, to say the least. Her first book, Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World, is the first full-length academic book focused on the women's department of the Church of God in Christ, COGIC. A regular host on the Melissa Harris Perry show on MSNBC, as I mentioned, Professor Butler also provides commentary on contemporary politics, religion, and social issues at religiondispatches.org, rd.org, and her own blog, You Might Think So. She also served as a consultant to PBS series God in America and The American Experience on Amy Semple McPherson. Professor Butler's future research projects include a book on African American women education and missions in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the sexual abuse cases in the American Catholic Church. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthea Butler.
I really want to thank everybody for coming tonight, because I don't understand why you all are here when you could be watching Scandal. What is that about? How does the screen come back on? How's that happen? What do we do? Somebody touch something. So I'm not going to touch anything because I'm a guest here, and when guests break things, they send you the check. So first of all, let me thank everyone in the Department for Religious Studies for trusting that I wouldn't come and say something that you'd have to regret for the rest of your life. Because if you know anything about me, sometimes when things happen on television, I say a thing, and then it becomes a bigger thing on certain kinds of websites and right-wing websites. So part of what I want to do tonight is to sort of talk a little bit about what I do and why I do it. And I want to do that in the course of talking about why our conversation about religion right now isn't that great. And you might think that it is a good conversation. You see things about religion on TV all the time. You see people saying certain kinds of things. Last week, we saw the president say something at the prayer breakfast, which you're going to see a little clip of in a minute, and it made everybody mightily upset. And I thought, I went to school and I did 2,000 years of Christian history, and I finally get to talk about the Crusades with somebody. This is great. So, but this talk has really been a moving target, and it's been a moving target in part because there are so many things happening right now in the world that are with regards to religion that I had a hard time trying to figure out where I should start. And I decided today, well, yesterday actually I decided this, so forgive me because I'm kind of coming off script. I decided yesterday that it would be good, instead of just talking to you, you needed to see some things. And part of the reason why you needed to see some things is because you need to understand the kind of discourse we have about religion right now. So those of you who are religious studies scholars, you've probably seen this Reza Aslan clip with Fox News, but I'm going to play a little bit of it for you so that you can get the full bore of what this is like.
Well, Reza Aslan was a Christian but converted back to the faith of his forefathers. It's Islam. He has now written a book about Jesus. The book has become controversial as it calls into question some of the core tenets of Christianity. The book is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And Reza joins me now from Los Angeles. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is an interesting book. Now, I want to clarify, you're a Muslim, so why did you write a book about the founder of Christianity?
Well, to be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including one in the New Testament and fluency in Biblical Greek, who has been studying the origins of Christianity for 2 decades, who also just happens to be a Muslim. So it's not that I'm just some Muslim writing about Jesus. I am an expert with a PhD in the history of religions. But I have been obsessed with Jesus.
Though, it still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually. So, I mean, it would be like asking a Christian why they would write a book about, Islam. I'm not sure about that. But honestly, I've been obsessed with Jesus for really 20 years. I've been studying his life and his work and the origins of Christianity, both in an academic environment and in a personal level for about 2 decades. And just to be clear, this is not some attack on Christianity. My mother is a Christian. My wife is a Christian. My brother-in-law is an evangelical pastor. Anyone who thinks that this book is an attack on Christianity has not read it yet.
I want to read you some quotes from some people who are criticizing you. One from John Dickerson, who has written an op-ed piece on FoxNews.com, and he says, it's not a historian's report on Jesus. Is it an educated Muslim's opinion about Jesus? He says its conclusions are long-held Islamic claims, namely that Jesus was a zealous prophet type who didn't claim to be God.
Well, that's actually not what Islam claims about Jesus. My book about Jesus overturns pretty much everything that Islam also thinks about Jesus.
I want to stop right there. This was the best clip ever. If this had happened to me, I'm telling you, I wouldn't be here tonight, because basically I'd be like on a yacht somewhere. Because he sold so many books off this. But I wanted to use this as a beginning for a couple of reasons. One is this whole tableau between having the religion scholar speak and have the talking head of Fox, this young woman whose name we don't need to know, and I don't want to embarrass her, but who looks very much out of her depth and probably just got the cards to ask the question 10 minutes beforehand. So you need to understand how this works. Basically, somebody does a little bit of research. They look at the book, maybe 5 minutes, 10 tops. They pick out a couple of things and they start to ask questions. And clearly, Reza Aslan did not know that he was going to get grilled about why would you write about Jesus if you're Muslim, right? And this turned viral, and he sold a lot of books behind it. It was really great. I mean, it's like that's one of those things you wish happens to you as a professor. You're like, I would go through everything that I had to endure via Fox News to sell that many books and get that many people to learn something for a change. But what's important about this is that it's a perfect example of the clash of what's happening right now with what we have to deal with in America and around the world about media. Because media only knows this much about things. They don't have a lot of time. They have to get in and out of a story. And so when Reza Aslan comes on, and he's a PhD, and I have 4 degrees, not 1, 4. He wants to talk about some really deep subjects about the book, and they want a soundbite. And in today's world, we can't do soundbite religion because there are a lot of complicated things going on. There are things that will make you crazy. So here we go. Let's do another one. Let's talk about Birmingham, England. Anybody in here been to Birmingham, England before? You seen a no-go zone in Birmingham? You don't know what that is, do you? Hold on. I'm going to tell you in a minute.
You basically have zones where Sharia courts are set up, where Muslim density is very intense, where the police don't go in, and where it's basically a separate country almost, a country within a country.
You know what it sounds like to me, Steve? It sounds like a caliphate within a particular country.
Well, it certainly does sound like that. It's almost the prescription that they're asking Israel to do, which is to set up a separate state within their own states. Except they're not recognizing it, and they're not dealing with it because they don't want to. I got into a tweet fight with the French ambassador who denied that there are any such things as no-go zones, except on the French, official website.
Well, Yes, what's happening is that the French are actually suing them. What he's going to say is that the French website has a place where they talk about these are the no-go zones that you go to. So a no-go zone, basically, in this particular person's term, was a place that there were only Muslims there. Okay, now I've been to Birmingham, England. I need to tell you that the only thing I got there was a bee sting. Okay. It was really fun, it was nice, but I did not see one Muslim no-go zone. But this is the kind of knowledge that people are getting from folks on TV. What you have here are two pundits who know anything about religion, okay? Not a thing. And he's talking about a Muslim no-go zone, and now Fox is being sued by France because he talked about them having no-go zones. He actually did Steve did a huge apology for this, but they had jokes about this for weeks. This has all been within the space of the month, but the best one has been the President of the United States. I'm going to let this one pray for a little while.
We see faith driving us to do right. But we also see faith being twisted and distorted, used as a wedge, or worse, sometimes used as a weapon. From a school in Pakistan to the streets of Paris, we have seen violence and terror perpetrated by those who profess to stand up for faith, their faith. Profess to stand up for Islam, but in fact are betraying it. We see ISIL, a brutal, vicious death cult that, in the name of religion, carries out unspeakable acts of barbarism, terrorizing religious minorities like the Yazidis, subjecting women to rape as a weapon of war, and claiming the mantle of religious authority for such actions.
Now, let me just stop here for a minute. Up to this point, everybody is with this guy, okay? Everybody is with him, but something's coming. Well, yeah, the subtitle.
We see sectarian war, the murder of Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, religious war in the Central African Republic, a rising tide of anti-Semitism and hate crimes in Europe, so often perpetrated in the name of religion. So how do we, as people of faith, reconcile these realities? The profound good, the strength, the tenacity, the compassion and love that can flow from all of our faiths, operating alongside those who seek to hijack religious for their own.
Good. Now, so he's going through this whole thing to say, this is religion, bad, whatever. Everybody's good until we get to this one little space. Let me just play this clip for you, because this is the clip that everybody goes crazy about.
In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow
Let me back it up.
all too often was justified in the name of Christ.
Sorry. Here we go. There we go.
Unique to some other place. Remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ. Michelle and I returned from India, an incredible, beautiful country, full of this magnificent diversity, but a place where in past years religious faiths of all types have, on occasion, been targeted by other peoples of faith simply due to their heritage and their beliefs.
Okay, let me stop there. Everybody was with the president until he said, and then Christianity and the Crusades and Jim Crow and slavery. Oops. It became a firestorm last week, okay? And it's still going on actually right now. One of the things that happened was that people were very upset about this statement. It was fine if you talked about ISIS and how that really wasn't religion and how that really wasn't Islam until you compared the kinds of things that happened with Christianity. And so when you have this kind of a discourse and you don't have an explanation, you have a president at a prayer breakfast with the Dalai Lama and all these other people who are just waiting for something. The prayer breakfast is almost one of the most politically charged things of the year for President Obama, because every time, if he shows up and he says something, it's bad. If he doesn't show up, it's bad because he didn't say anything, okay? So he can't win for losing. For this year, when he decided to talk about ISIS and the horrible things that have happened underneath that regime, and to compare it to Christianity, people went ballistic. And so this is a moment where, as academics, we can talk about this in the classroom. We can do the nuance. But when you hear the soundbite of what this sounds like, people go nuts. And they begin to say sorts of things that actually drive the conversation about religion. So I have one more clip to show you, and then I'm going to really start talking to you, okay? Because I want you to understand that this is changing our conversation in a very different way. And let me go forward here to get to the point. I'm actually picking on somebody from NBC and MSNBC, so you can call them up and say I said some bad things.
To walk humbly in the path of the Lord. The Lord's ways are mysterious. And so you're saying, we're prone to zealotry. As John said, we're fallen.
But David,
and so to underline that's useful in Washington today. That's useful always.
You don't use the word crusade, number one, in any context right now. It's too fraught. And the week after a pilot is burned alive and a video shown, you don't lean over backwards to be philosophical about the sins of the fathers. You have to deal with the issue that's in front of you, or don't deal with it at all. Talk about faith.
Kirk, you get to the point. Our political culture does not allow for much nuanced debate.
We're not allowed to have a nuance, right?
Unfortunately, this is, as you have just shown with John Meacham, this is a very nuanced debate to be had, and that should be had. But having it in the context of 30 seconds added into a speech at a prayer breakfast, where the impulse of the president's opponents is just to jump on him and criticize him for anything, whatever he said, is very strong. It's unfortunate, but I don't think it's possible.
Now, let me tell you who that was talking. First of all, she's not from American television. That's Katty Kay from the BBC. They can have a nuanced conversation at BBC, okay? And the person who was speaking was Anthea Mitchell, who has a show on MSNBC. You can't say the word crusade. Why can't you? George Bush said that word. George Bush said that word when they were starting the Iraq War. He said that word and he used it. He said, this is a crusade, this is crusade. And everybody responded back then to that word. So now Anthea Mitchell is saying, you can't use this word. So where are the religion scholars in the midst of this? Who's asking us, who's asking people in this department, why can't you use that word? Are we going to allow Anthea Mitchell to put the dictates about what can and can't be said about religion? Right now, we have a complicated situation, and the complicated situation is this. Most of the people talking about religion that are in the public right now don't know how to talk about religion. I think that's pretty clear from these clips, okay? Whether it's a president or a pundit or Fox News, any of the outlets right now that are trying to deal with religion have fallen short. Part of the reason why they've fallen short is because they have certain ideas about what they think religion is. They have an ideology that is driven, that they need people to watch, first of all. Second, they need to be able to explain things in very short, precise kinds of ways, or imprecise kinds of ways, depending on what you want to watch. And then third, they don't really dive in the way that scholars and other people do that study these things to try to understand it. But there's another problem on top of all of that, and that's part of what I want to talk about tonight, is how are we allowing this discourse about religion to be driven by other people who, A, don't spend a lot of time studying it, B, might not care about it, and C, have the kinds of biases that we might not want to have people talk about. So, of course, there's a kind of a bias in a certain kind of a station, maybe like Fox. They might say, we're just not going to be for Islam like this, and we want certain kinds of people to come in front of us to talk about ISIS. Or if you're watching CNN, they actually have a belief section on their website where you can look at where they talk about belief and somebody who's sort of trained a little bit. Or if you look at Huffington Post, they have a whole section that's dedicated to religion right now. If you look at something that I write for, Religion Dispatches, we have scholars and other kinds of practitioners who are very learned that write for us. But the fact of the matter is the everyday person doesn't have a really good place to go to figure this out, right? And so how do you understand what's going on in the world today? How do you understand the complexities of the religious scene that we're in right now? How do you get this? And so what I want to talk about tonight is a few things. One is sort of a brief history about how we've understood this conversation about religion in America, a popular kind of a conversation. Where does that come from? Second, I want to talk about the problems inherent in that. And third, I want to talk about what I think might be some prescriptives for that. And if somebody can get me a glass of water, that'd be really great. I just ran out of my tea. And I'm not going to make it in this dry environment. I forgot to bring my water up here. You know, you don't want to see me up here with cotton mouth trying to get through this talk, okay? So there's a few things that are at stake. So let me just talk about those first, and then I want to move into this history section. The first thing is what we need to do is what they call in our big organization, the American Academy of Religion, it's a public understanding of religion. And we've had a lot of people in the past that have been able to do this public understanding of religion. In the past, we had people like the Niebers in the 1950s, or Billy Graham and others who've talked about religion publicly and have been able to, thank you very much, to say things about religion, and we believe them, in part because they were either theologians or someone like that. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing that stakes, is how does the public understand religion and the function of religion in the country? Right now, if you think you understand religion in America, what you probably think is, I understand that religion is very important for one political party, not so important for another religious political party, and that, yeah, most people go to church, but there's these things called the nuns, and I don't know what they really do, but they don't go to church and they don't do anything, okay? And then there's Muslims and some other people, and occasionally there's these people with turbans that are called Sikhs, and we don't know what they really are, except this place got shot up a couple years ago, and that was really bad. People shouldn't shoot in people's places of worship, okay? Did I cover it? I think I did. And this is bad because you don't know the differences. There's nothing there to tell you what those differences are unless you are in some kind of academic environment where you can learn about that. Second is rhetoric. The rhetoric is really high, okay? So once the president said these comments about the Crusades and Christianity and Jim Crow and slavery being based in those kinds of things, people got upset. One former governor of Virginia, I believe it was, said this was the worst thing he ever heard a president say. Well, that's already hyperbole, right? So you can't even have a discussion about this because you have to choose a side. They make you choose a side. You can't have a discourse. And so what happens when you get this hyperbolic kind of rhetoric is that you don't have a conversation about religion. Number three, how do you report on these kinds of conflicts? How do we report on Daesh or ISIS? How do you report on Boko Haram? How do you report on Charlie Hebdo? During a time in which you don't have all the people in the field that you used to have from the networks, first of all, because they've been cut down. You don't have as many religion journalists anymore because all of those religion people have been cut down. So Gustav Niebuhr, who he brought up today, who I know, that was back in the 90s that he was in the New York Times. And there were probably 3 or 4 people doing this at the New York Times. Now I think there's 2, okay? Most local papers don't have anybody anymore. Used to be a religion editor or a religion writer almost at every major newspaper in the country. That has shrunk tremendously because the newsrooms have shrunk. Same thing with broadcast television. There's nobody dedicated to doing religion on these major networks right now. The fact that you actually see a religion scholar on television like Reza Aslan or me or somebody else that they call up occasionally when bad things happen, or they put somebody who's in a collar, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to talk about religion because that means that validates whatever religious tradition that is. That becomes the go-to person. And that's it. You don't have anybody else. So you have to end up trusting that they're telling you the right thing. But most of the time they're not, okay? But the problem and the biggest issue I see right now is that these people who are talking about religion, either in the print media or in the media that you see on TV or the media that you might engage in social media, if they're not knowledgeable enough, they are the ones driving the conversation. And we as scholars and people who want to learn more about religion are not driving that conversation. And what does that mean? It means that we're taking their language to talk about things that we know better about. And that's a problem. And so what I want to do is talk about a little bit about this tonight and how this is playing out in some very interesting places around the world right now. Because if you don't pay attention, and if you watch your every nightly news, let's say hopefully you don't like Brian Williams, right? Because you're not going to see him for a while. And that's really kind of a sad thing. But if you're only watching nightly news and you're reading your newspaper every day, you don't understand that right now that most of the conflicts on the planet Earth are about religious conflicts. They are wrestling with, people are wrestling with religion in many, many countries around this world. And so instead of sort of paying attention to our navel gazing that we like to do here in America at times, what I want to do is sort of take a step back and talk about our history of navel gazing, first of all, a little bit anyway. And then second of all, talk about some pretty big things right now that are going on that I think are really important, and we need to begin to talk about them in a different way. Because if we don't talk about them in a different way, we're going to find ourselves in a really bad situation. So let's start off in the 1950s. Do you recognize these two guys? Nobody knows who that is. That guy with the snake over there, that's Billy Graham. He doesn't look like that now. I'm going to tell you something right now, though. If Billy Graham dies within this next year, it is going to be one of the biggest deaths this nation has ever had. You're going to see like days and days and days of people talk about Billy Graham, and you'll be sick of seeing me because you're going to have to call like 5 of us to come talk about him, okay? And I'll probably be one of those 5, maybe. They have a scholar right now who I know who's done something on Billy Graham, so they'll call him up a lot too. The man on the right is Bishop Fulton J. Sheen. Fulton J. Sheen was amazing for this reason. In the 1950s, he had a television show in which, I wish this was a full frontal picture, I didn't have one of him, I should have showed you, that he had basically on a red cape, he kind of looked a little bit like Dracula. It was really good, liturgical garments back then. How Then Shall We Live? And this was a show that was on every week. And so the beginnings of religious programming in the 1950s was really about talking about ethical issues, how people wanted to think about their faith. And so there were lots of Protestants that ended up watching a Catholic. This is the first Catholic they ever got close to, because they saw that show every week. And so it defined how they began to think about religious relationship. Or most people ended up seeing somebody like evangelist Billy Graham. These are both from 1951 and 1952, by the way, okay? And these men are on the cover of Time magazine, and this is a public conversation about religion. But the public conversation about religion is a very mainstream conversation about religion. It's mostly Protestant-led. It's about religion in the face of a coming communist threat and what you have to do about it. It's about personal faith, civics, love of God, love of nation. Those things came together, okay? So that's sort of a 50s kind of realm. What you begin to see is a difference when we come to the 1960s, okay? And the difference becomes when we get into the political. So if you remember 1960, JFK, he's a Catholic. He has to talk about being Catholic. And so he does a very big talk about this during the election time so that people will know that he's not going to be beholden to the Pope or the Vatican, that he will be able to be the president on his own. So this is a moment in our national life that people have to start to think about, can we have a president that has a faith that's not like mine? Can we do this? And how do we have a public discourse about it? Now, this guy over here, Billy Graham, didn't really like that much. And Billy Graham did a lot to try to figure out, how can I not get JFK in office? Okay, didn't work. So you had to kind of eat that one. But there was something else that happened a year before JFK that was really interesting. A lot of people don't think about this, but I like to think about it as the first moment that people begin to think about how you're going to talk about different kinds of religions and what you do about it. And that's a documentary called The Hate That Hate Produced. And this was about what they termed a Muslim group, but this was actually the Nation of Islam. And if you haven't seen this before, you can pick it up on YouTube or whatever. And I think it's actually a really good look to see how people are being portrayed. So I just want to play a little bit of this so you can kind of get a sense of what Mike Wallace and Lomax are doing in this video to talk about the differences. And I'm going to just get in front of this a little bit and let it start playing. Let's go. There we go. 1 second. So you can see how this already looks.
The indictment you've just heard is being delivered over and over again in most of the major cities across the country. This charge comes at the climax of a morality play called The Trial. The plot, indeed the message of the play, is that the white man has been put on trial for his sins against the black man. He has been found guilty. The sentence is death. The play is sponsored, produced by a Negro religious group who call themselves the Muslims. They use a good deal of the paraphernalia of the traditional religion of Islam, but they are fervently disavowed by Orthodox Muslims. These homegrown Negro American Muslims are the most powerful of the black supremacist groups. They now claim a membership of at least 250,000 Negroes. Their doctrine is being taught in 50 cities across the nation. Let no one underestimate the Muslims. They have...
I just wanted to stop it right there because I'm not kidding you. You could play this right now on Fox and it would work. Right? It would work. Okay, so what do you think if you're in 1959, you're a white person sitting in New York City, because this played on one of the local New York City stations. You're watching this. What are you thinking? My God, I'm completely afraid of these people. They are nuts. They're in 50 states. They're doing all this stuff. Look at them. They look different than me. Look at all those women dressed this way. There's no explanation about this, right? But we haven't really moved off that much from that kind of portrayal, have we? Because it's the same thing. But this was the beginning. You could just update this a little bit and put a couple of different pictures in it. It would work just fine. Right, Lynn? It would work. So how do you think the people who think about this stuff, how do you begin to sort of see this historical trajectory? In the 70s, what happens is that you have a different thing that splits apart altogether. One is about religion and politics and media. So you have Jimmy Carter, who's the first born-again president, and how they begin to cover him and how they cover his faith. And they talk about him being a churchgoer and all this, or you end up seeing him in Hustler magazine because he said, I sinned because I looked at a woman with lust in my eyes. You know, that's the print media. Or you get the print media that's starting to cover the beginnings of what we would call the religious right and how they covered it. But then there's this other media piece that happens. And the other media piece is the media that's being produced by religious people themselves. So CBN, TBS, TBN, all of these people who begin to make religious broadcasting a very different thing than it was in the 50s. And so now what you have are two different kinds of streams. One stream is a stream that says, we need to report on this because it might be political, and how are we going to think about it? The other stream is that we need to do this for ourselves. We need to start having things like the 700 Club. We need to tell our own news stories because we want to tell the stories the way we want to tell them, okay? Now, there's a third piece of this, and I'll try to make it as quick and simple as possible. There's the print piece. And the print piece becomes very important because what you have is an organization called the Religious News Association. And part of what they did in the 50s was these were all religious people writing about religion. And they were writing in local newspapers. So some of you are old enough to remember, I grew up reading these things. I would look at all the church ads in the paper. This is why I ended up doing what I did. I would read all the church ads in the Houston Chronicle every weekend when they came. Usually it was on Saturday. And there would be stories about churches. Or there would be stories about a particular pastor. At a certain time of year, you would talk about faith. But these were all either Protestant and a few things about Catholics. Catholics had their own newspapers. So they didn't even have to go into the regular newspaper. They had a local newspaper that was for the diocese or the archdiocese. So they could get their news that way. But what happened was you had a change. And beginning at the end, mid-60s to the end of the 60s, they decided that we need to open up this organization to have more people that are not necessarily religious that want to report on religion. And that's when this really begins to explode in a different kind of way, so that you see people like Gustav Niebuhr, Bob Smediana, and others join into newspapers and print media, and they're doing a lot of things to tell stories about religion. And these usually are great stories because they have a little bit more of a nuance, right? But what happens? We all know, how many of you get a physical newspaper at home now? I just want to see. Wow. 2 people. 2 people. 2 people get a physical newspaper at home. We? Yeah. Sunday, once a week. Okay? See how that's changed? So you don't even get a newspaper at home and you read everything online. So you curate what you want to read. You don't read a paper cover to cover anymore. So if there was even religion programming in the newspaper, religious articles, you don't even see that anymore, right? So how do you get it? How does it happen? Well, one way it happens is because of big, giant events. And so that's where I want to start to talk about the present day. And I want to talk about something that was a really big issue for me, and a thing that hasn't been talked about so much religiously, except maybe in the first few weeks, and that was the embassy bombing in Benghazi. There was a movie called The Innocence of Muslims. So here I'm going to tell you a bad social media story about me. I have not talked about this in public before, so you now get the story. It's the first time I've talked about it in length. The morning that this happened, in September, I got up, I saw that the embassy in Libya had been bombed, and I was on social media, on Twitter. This was 2012. I was on a sabbatical that they owed me for a semester, and I was chilling, and I got upset about the story. And the first thing I said, in my religious scholar way, was, I wish they would arrest this guy that did this movie. Now, why did I say that? I said it for a couple of reasons. I said it kind of as a little bit hyperbolic, but I meant that every time somebody does something to burn a Quran, or to, like Terry Jones, or a movie like The Innocence of Muslims, there is a response. And what we think in the West sometimes is that, well, they should just believe like us. They should just be like us. They should just accept our things about free speech. They should pay attention to it. They need to just learn. And that's it. And you know, why are they mad? He could do a movie he wanted to. But that movie ended up being, after a lot of research and work, actually part of the reason why that embassy was bombed, taken over, and 4 people's lives were lost. Now, nobody knew that day that this happened, but the day that it happened, when we knew that 4 people had died, and we knew that that reports were coming out that people had seen this movie, The Innocence of Muslims, and I'll tell you a little bit about the movie in a minute, it became a big thing. And I got picked up by a site called Twitchy, and for about a week, I got cussed out on Twitter because people believed I didn't believe in free speech. Now, the first thing was a mess up, but the second thing I did was a real mess up. I tried to explain what I was saying in 300 words. I have learned a big lesson now. This is why I can have this talk with you tonight. Never try to explain religion in 300 words. Doesn't work. And the USA Today called me that afternoon when things had really started and said, can you write about what you said on Twitter? And this was the first time I realized people are actually reading tweets and trying to make content out of this? I don't understand. But it's a real thing now, okay? So we've come a long way in 3 years, or maybe we've come a short way in 3 years. And so I wrote this piece, and then it just made everything worse, because what I was trying to say was basically this. He has the right to make a movie, but people don't have to receive those things the same way we think they're going to receive them. They have faith kind of commitments. And it's not so much that we have to, honor their commitments and change what we do. We just need to realize that there are consequences when people do certain things. And that maybe we need to think about having a conversation about what people do believe, and is that really the case or not? And so that didn't happen very well during this conversation, obviously, and it became a really bad thing. Now, here's the funny part. Nikuli Masula, I can't pronounce his name very well. I'm from Texas, we don't pronounce names really well. Who made this movie, basically made a very cheap movie out in the desert and hired some people, and he wasn't supposed to be doing this because he had already had a conviction against him for something else about computer things, and he wasn't supposed to do certain kinds of movies or do anything for like a year as part of his probation package. And basically this was a violation of his probation package. That was a way that he ended up being arrested and spending almost a year in jail. But the whole point in the Middle East, and for people who were adherents to Islam, was that this was offensive, and that the way that this movie had spread on YouTube was offensive to the Prophet. Now, there's different ways we can talk about this, and I won't go into it tonight, but I do want to say a couple of things about this. One is that part of our distaste for all of these things comes from a misunderstanding of Islam. We don't really quite want to pay attention to, well, they say you're not supposed to do a picture of the Prophet, but you can in certain kinds of traditions of Islam. That's a historic thing that has a long arc of development. People don't really understand that. But the second thing is that what sometimes gets to be very difficult in the media to parse out is that people's beliefs are sometimes very dear to them. And they are the reasons why they do certain things. And that we can't usually say that the line that I always hate in the media that happens right now is basically, they didn't really mean it. It's not religiously based. That's usually a lie too. And so when this movie thing happened, it became sort of a flashpoint. But we've had many flashpoints since then. And the Middle East has been in this sort of place. But we don't really quite understand what's happening with Islam right now. And part of that problem is that we don't have a good picture about the scope of all these different conflicts that are happening. If we think about Nigeria and Boko Haram, if we think about Pakistan, if we think about Syria, if we think about Iran, Iraq, if we think about Europe and what's happening with Islam, if we begin to put all of these things together, we can see that we have a problem in how to talk about a big religious tradition that's very complex and has different factions, but you don't get to hear that all of the time. And so what's our job? How do we do this? So let me just talk about this in sort of an order. I want to talk about Boko Haram first because that's been a big one for me that I've been tracking. Boko Haram, Western education's forgetting Haram means forbidden. So this group has been in Nigeria for a long time. What doesn't get talked about in the media is that you have an interesting sort of clash that's happening right now. If some of you know this, Nigeria has had to postpone their elections that were supposed to happen on Saturday. Why are they postponing it? Because Boko Haram has been using 10-year-old girls to bomb things. They have basically almost taken over the north of the country. You haven't heard this very much in our news because that seems to be very far away. And nobody's connecting this with ISIS. Nobody's connecting this with anything else. They want some of the same things. They say they want a caliphate. Everybody says, oh, this is not religious. I want to just read a quote from a scholar that is in South Africa that drove me crazy. Let me just pull my piece of paper out here real quick and make sure I got it. That really made me nuts because basically what he says is, you know, there's no reason why we should think about this as religious. There's no reason to think about it as religious because basically there's not a strategy, they're not picking up anything, it's not a territorial strategy, and that some of these villages that have been bombed are taking over. This is about getting land. It's a territorial strategy, and that, oh well, some churches got bombed, but they're not doing that anymore. And so we really shouldn't think about this as being religious. That's wrong. They say themselves that it's religious. They say themselves that they want to bring forth an Islamic state. They are fighting in a place in the country where there's other Muslims, but people say because there's other Muslims there and you're bombing them, they must not want to, it's not religious. Yes, it is. If they're not like you and you want to impose your brand of Islam on somebody else that's not practicing your brand, it's religious. That's part of it. And so we have to learn how to talk about this with nuance. The president of Nigeria right now, Goodluck Jonathan, is a Christian. Where has he been the last month? Churches every week, every weekend, talking about how he's going to defeat Boko Haram. We're going to get rid of them in 6 weeks by the time the election happens. That's not going to happen. They haven't been able to get rid of them for 10 years. It's not going to happen now, it's not going to happen ever. Why is he saying these things? He comes out of Pentecostal Christianity. He's trying to talk his people down so that they won't get upset. This whole thing that's happening in Nigeria right now has so many religious roots to it, but we don't hear it that way in the news. We hear 200 girls get kidnapped, and so this is a picture of those girls. When they got kidnapped, what did they do with them? They said, we're going to teach you the Quran, we're going to marry you off. Now it's been almost a year. It will be a year in April. We are in February. How do you lose 200 girls? How many girls and young boys have been taken since then and re-indoctrinated? But this is not religious. What's religious then? What is religious? So that's the first one. Everybody remembers this. Charlie Hebdo. I showed, this picture is basically of one of the covers of the magazine. This is what the AP did. The AP decided that everything that happened was so bad that they could not show the covers anymore. And so when the massacre happened, and there were two different things that happened that day. First, it was the headquarters that everybody was shot up at, and then the Jewish grocery store where the shootings happened. There was a decision made. And so in this haste, they decided we don't ever print bad pictures. And this has been a very big thing that has happened a lot for Islam. We don't sell those pictures anymore. So that was the cover that the AP showed, the blank cover, because they wanted to be responsible. But part of that means that you don't really see what's happening. You can see it every place. It's all over Twitter. All the covers, everything was all over Twitter. And so now we have to make a choice. What is this about? Is it about free speech? The way we think about free speech and the way the French think about it is very different than the way somebody, would think about it who's sympathetic to ISIS. No, they're not believing in free speech. That's an insult because they're insulting the Prophet, Muhammad. So how do we talk about this? It was so frustrating to hear all of these broadcasts because the broadcasts didn't really talk about the religious component. They just said whether or not it was appropriate to show the pictures. But they didn't talk about the why underneath that. There were some people that came on, it was good, but the programming is just the same. So now what's just happened this week? In addition to this is what's appearing on a bunch of cars in Paris since the attack. This was 2 days ago. I want you to know that's Jewish, it means Jews. And so now you have two big things going on in France. One is a Jewish population that does not feel comfortable being there anymore because they feel like they're being a target. And the second, a Muslim population that feels as though they're being targeted because of things that other people have done. Again, all about religion. But nobody wants to talk about it that way because it's France and they got a whole history about religion, which is kind of messed up, right? Nobody will talk about it. What are they going to do? What do we do when we talk about religion? So what does the big media place do? This is what CNN does. When the president talked about the Crusades last week, they brought on a rabbi, a priest, and an imam. Sounds like a joke, doesn't it? Because they know. We're not going to talk about a religious studies scholar about this. You know. Who are the people that know something? I happen to know Father Beck there at the end. He's the one that they drag out for anything that happens in the Catholic Church. He is there in a minute, okay? Anything that's Christian, it's Father Beck, okay? The other two guys, I don't know where they got them from. They're not regulars, but Father Beck is, okay? Now, why am I picking on this? Part of the reason why I'm picking on this is because it's not as though they don't know things about this, but they don't have the capacity to kind of move between these spaces that are really difficult to talk about. So you get people of faith to come on and talk about it because that validates whatever it is that the media wants to say. It makes it easier. You can have them say, oh, this is terrible. What the president said about the Crusades was awful. And so now we should really think about this a different way. Or maybe it was true, but we should moderate our language. But the moderation doesn't get you anywhere, it doesn't get you any knowledge. And that's a problem too. And then finally, this is probably the worst one. It's Pegida in Germany right now. I don't know if anybody's been following this. This is really serious, okay? Good, I'm glad. Pegida is a right-wing group right now that is anti-Islam and anti-immigrant. And basically, their leader, who had to quit a few weeks ago because they got a picture of him doing the Heil Hitler salute, they have been having marches in places like Dusseldorf and Leipzig and Dresden, and tens of thousands of people have been coming out on Mondays because they don't want foreigners in their country anymore. They don't want Muslims in the country anymore. This is sweeping across Europe, okay? This is not the only place that happens. It's happening in France, things are happening in England, and we're not paying attention because we don't have the capacity to start to pull these stories together to say, maybe there's something going on. Maybe there's something we need to pay attention to. And so what I'm thinking about these days, at least, and what I'm trying to sort of suss out is how can we talk about religion in a different way? How can we talk about this as not just sort of a use of politics in this country that we look at and with some disdain and say, oh, that's just because some Republicans want to say something and want to get votes. It's much more than that now. We have a serious situation. Ever since 9/11 in this country, we've had two different kinds of rhetorics. One kind of rhetoric is that there's been a respect for Islam. George Bush did a lot to do that. I will give him credit for that. He did that in the days after 9/11. That was really important. But we've also had some really horrible things happen because people are afraid. They are afraid of different religious traditions. They're especially afraid of Islam. And that doesn't work. We need to begin to talk about religion in a different way. We can't just say, listen to Fox and hear somebody say there's a no-go zone when they don't even know what Birmingham looks like, let alone anything else. So how do we talk about this? How do we do this? How do we think about the end? Well, let me give a few things I want to say, and then we can have some question time. One way I think we begin to do this is a different kind of education. We have always been afraid in our high schools to talk about religion for different kinds of reasons. And I believe it's time to start to teach these traditions at least in a very basic way. If you talk to most Americans, they couldn't tell you what was in their Bible anyway, let alone anything else anybody else was doing. Most junior high and high schoolers around the world get a little bit of somebody else's religion. If you are in a big, European country, you know something about Islam by the time you're 17 or 18. You might not like it, but you know something. You know something about Christianity. You know a little bit about Hinduism. You know about the major religions. We don't do that here in America. We need to start thinking about it. So that's one. Two is that we need to start to engender some different kinds of conversations. We need to hold our media people accountable. I'm only one of me. As Bob Smeniano, who used to work for the Tennessean in Nashville, said, you're the most notorious religion professor in the country. And I said, thank you. I said, I don't know if I like that title or not, but I would like to be notorious for the fact that I was out there because I was trying to make a public understanding of religion. And that's what we're missing right now. The way that we have a public understanding of religion is basically we respect people in authority who look like religious authorities, if we're believers, at least, if we think that that's a valid thing to do. We say that this is a country that anybody can have religious freedom, but what happens in our media is something else altogether. You don't get to learn about this in a newspaper. The people are already overstretched. There's no nuance to these conversations, and you don't get to hear about Boko Haram or ISIS or any other group that's going on right now that is part of what the big wars are in this world that are religious in nature, because nobody knows how to talk about religion. So they haven't done you a service. The third thing I think, and this is the charge to my colleagues here, is that I need more of you to get involved in this conversation. And part of that reason is because I think what you saw from Reza Aslan, why would anybody want to go on TV, right? Why would you want to talk about this? Whenever somebody calls you up from the local station, you probably look and you see whatever that CBS station or the Fox station is, you probably go, I'm not picking that up. Or they call the office and they say, I'm not really in, I can't talk to them, when something happens. And I want to encourage you, if you can't talk, somebody please talk. Because even in a 2 to 3 minute conversation with somebody, you can teach somebody something. I made a decision back in 2007 that every time somebody called me to talk about religion, that I would talk to them and I would help them. I would help them to try to understand. Because I figured that was a part of the learning process, and that was part of the teaching that I was supposed to do. And so what has happened is that now I have a set of people who call me up all the time about religion, which is kind of painful. But at the same time, I'm able to point them in some directions quicker than they could find on their own. I just did a clip last Friday on Chris Hayes. And when they call, they don't know. They'd say, give us some talking points. And so this is about the Crusades. Everybody's been fussing about the Crusades. What should we do? I said, well, you should know that in a certain way, people who went on the Crusades were just like people who might want to die and be martyrs. If you died, you got all your sins forgiven and you got your debts paid off. They were like, cool. So the next thing you know, that's part of the clip. And I thought I did my job. Somebody didn't have to watch the History Channel tonight, and they got a short little clip and they learned something about the Crusades. That was really helpful. But it doesn't help in cases like this. And this is the last thing I want to show. And this is what I decided I would add this picture because this has been a very big question. These are 3 students who were shot and killed by a neighbor. They just had their funeral today, 3 Muslims. 2 of them were married to each other. 1 was about to be married. The neighbor who shot them, supposedly, due to his wife, says that, oh, this was about parking. I don't think it's about parking. I know that people shoot over things about cars and things, but I have to think that why shoot them? If you've been fighting with everybody else in the apartment building about parking, why do you shoot the 3 Muslims? What's going on? Oh, and by the way, this is not a Christian that did this. This is somebody who's an atheist. And that's also a conversation, because now we got to talk about, we can't just talk about people of faith in here. We have to talk about people who don't have faith, who are mad at the people who have faith. That's a real complication, because sometimes the people who don't have any faith act like the people who have faith. That made you confused? Think about Bill Moore. If you watch him on Friday night, you'll know what I'm talking about. He's a very good evangelist for hating everything about religion. And he talks in a way just like really evangelists of religion do. He can't even understand that he frames his arguments about hating religion in the same way that people who love religion frame their arguments. So what are we going to do? How's this going to turn out? There's a huge turnout at the memorial service last night for them. The funeral was today. You have a man that's in jail, never going to get out, never going to get any bail. Who knows if he'll be charged with a hate crime or not? But every Muslim person to a fault is afraid. All the social media I read yesterday and this morning while I was here, everybody's fearful. Can I wear my hijab? Can I do something? What can I do? And that's because they're responding to what's going on in the rest of the world. They're paying attention because it's their religious tradition. What can they say? How are we going to be in that conversation? What I want you to get out of this tonight is not that, oh great, this person from TV came and said we should talk about religion more. I'm saying something deeper than that. I'm saying that we have to change the conversation we have about religion. You can't get what you learn about religion from somebody that talks to you for 5 seconds on a TV screen. We have to be able to engender conversations in the local spaces where we are. However we do that. There used to be a time when people used to do interfaith and interreligious dialogue all the time. All that stuff has gone away. Nobody does that anymore. The world is too busy. You feel like you can connect with somebody on Facebook, you can connect on Twitter, you can connect on all these things. But what we're not having are conversations. What we're not doing is finding out how we talk about religion and realizing when people say, this is what I believe, and I'm ready to kill a whole bunch of people to do it, do they really mean it? You know, our Western value is we need to stay alive. Somebody else's value is like, if I die, it's good, that's all good. That's a different way of thinking. We need to begin to put ourselves in a space where we can understand what that thinking is and understand that religion is a huge part of what is going on in this world today. We can't treat it as though it's a sidebar anymore. It needs to come front and center. And I hope tonight, at least what I've done is just to get you to start to think about that and to start to think about religion in a different way. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm not losing my voice. It's just starting to kind of go like a frog. I don't know how much time we have. I was bad on time tonight. Yes?
I'm happy with you tremendously.
Thank you. You've been around for 43 years, so you tell me that, I'm really happy. I just want to teach that long.
And one of the reasons is that up until about 10 years ago, I was exactly the same position you are now with the media and so forth. I had the same experiences, and I had the same kind of reaction and so forth. But I want to ask you a question, because my frustration then and now, it's not just with the media.
Yeah.
It's with our field.
Yeah.
I mean, because, I was on all these national television shows, and I was a new age expert.
Yeah. I probably saw you.
I was the face. And my academic colleagues look at me and say, well, that's this thing, but go on. And the reason I was the face was because nobody else would talk about it.
Yeah.
Nobody else would dirty their hands go out and go down to a bookstore and read this stuff and try to understand it and so forth.
Yeah.
Because, we've had critics of the field that say basically we're into our text. We live in this kind of romanticized version of religion. We also have this notion, this sort of idealized version of religion, particularly in pluralistic Americans, like, well, all religions are good. After Waco, one should have drawn the conclusion.
Waco should never happen the way it did. That was a big mess up.
But still, it's almost like a hypnosis in our field.
Yeah.
We don't want to look at it as being a kind of conflictual force.
No, I think, I kind of addressing it now because I think one of the things that's happening, that's changing, is that so many other fields are doing religion right now. is that you can't just be in that, you can't be in that sort of balkanized space to think what I do is good and everything is good and that's that. And if you've got anthropologists, you've got people doing ethnic studies doing religion, you've got people doing poli-sci doing religion. I mean, it's ad infinitum. So I think that's one of the things that when you begin to see other people talking about religion who aren't the religious studies scholars, you've lost the argument. And I think that's a very big thing. I think the second thing about being text-based is hugely important. And I'm a person who loves to write, I love to read, I do all that stuff. And on my best day, I'd rather be in my pajamas writing in front of the computer. But guess what? That's not driving the conversation anymore. People can barely read 100 pages now. I think actually they barely can read 10, to be truthful. Because they pick up their information in different ways. There's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's short video clips. Even the way you watch news is different now. The two people who said they had newspapers and you said it was only Sunday, right? You don't even read that thing cover to cover anymore because you can read selectively. So you don't ever have to read anything about religion. You don't even have to see it if you don't want to. So that's, I think, is the change for us. And I think if we don't understand how this is changing now, it becomes really problematic. I think the other thing, and this is where I'm going to, give a big up to my colleagues at Penn, because I think we're trying to do something very different in terms of how to teach religious studies and what we do in the public eye, is to talk about religion in some different ways that are torn apart from a text. I mean, we write our books, we do everything. But, one of my colleagues, Jamal Elias, who does Islam, he's working on comic books right now. Islamic comic books. He had a big book about, painted trucks in Pakistan. Right? His whole book, Aisha's Cushion, dealt with about the depictions of Muhammad before, all this gets locked down. So there's different ways to go about it. My colleague, Justin McDaniels, is doing stories about this ghost and a monk story from Thailand that has gone on. So you think about how can you take something and do something different with it? How do you talk about religion in different ways? I'm trying to do religion in media more at Penn now, so that we come out of some different ways of thinking about things. It's not to say that the old way is bad. It's just that we need to retool for what this is now. And, I'm thinking back to Juergensmeyer's book on religion and violence and how that was a big thing when, 9/11 happened. And remember, that was a moment when everybody got talked about. If you did Islam, it was like boom. And that's why Islam is still booming for jobs, because everybody still wants an Islamicist as a response to 9/11. They don't want an Islamicist because it was a big world religion. They wanted it because it was terror. And that was the way they read it. And so I think if we can respond differently to these kinds of things that are happening on the ground, I think that's the future for me of religious studies. To talk more about the lived instead of the theoretical. I mean, I'm not saying to run away from the theoretical law. I'm just saying we need to see what people are doing and how they're doing it and the complicated ways in which they're doing it. And I think that's where I feel like the next sort of wave of how we bridge these worlds happens. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm very much with you. Back in the days of Northern Ireland,
Oh, yeah.
I came more and more to believe that what was being portrayed as Catholic Protestant was really about how much British influence was tolerable.
Yeah.
And so there we have kind of the opposite.
It is opposite.
A conflict that being portrayed in religious terms when it was really
about something else altogether.
Somewhat more secular.
Yeah.
Or broader. I'm just wondering, was that true? Or?
Yeah, no, that's partially true. I think, this is where still talking about religion, I think, helps, because in a way, religion got co-opted, right? to make this conflict go into a certain kind of way when it was really this other external force that's happening on the outside. And that's always the complicated part about religion, is that sometimes it is religion, but sometimes it's religion and something else. And it's the and that we are, at least in my field, people are loath to add. They don't know how to do and. Right. So if I do religion and politics, and I have to understand that sometimes it's politics and sometimes it's religion and sometimes it's both. So I think that's the ways in which we talk about it. But even the way, the shorthand and the ways the Troubles got portrayed, again, was sort of a media convention. It's easier to talk about Catholics versus Protestants than to talk about Catholics versus Protestants trying to figure out their way with Great Britain and how this works for Ireland. and the kinds of historic things that had happened in Ireland before. So if you had a deeper understanding, you could get at some of that and say, it's not all this all the time. But it's easier to just see, orange men beating up on people, right? Or what just happened recently with Sinn Féin and those records coming out of BC, I believe it was BC or BU, I can't remember, I think it was BC. And, people getting arrested because of that woman's death, and that now they're figuring out things. So yeah, it haunts you in different kinds of ways, and it's not the same everywhere. I mean, the things I picked today were unique because I see Islam as being this mix, this complex right now of some real difficult things happening around the world. But we're not trying to make these stories sort of realize, oh, this is a huge issue right now. You just might look at it piecemeal, when if you get on top of it, it looks a lot different.
Well, and I wonder if a large portion of the population are, Sunday morning Christians.
Oh, yeah. If they're that at all.
But you can easily separate, this is my religious life, this is the rest of the
Yeah, yeah.
And for me, for these folks, you can't really make that separation.
And that's why
Religious.
Yeah, if you wear hijab, you can't separate.
Yeah.
You can't, your physical presence cannot separate you from what this is.
It's the entire way you look at the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's the place of the big issue. What do you do? I keep thinking about in France when I teach my women religion course, one of the things we always talk about is, a hijab. And I keep saying, this is going to come to America. I'm starting to see the cases already. You have to understand that there's going to come a time where we're going to have to make a decision whether you're going to wear a head covering or not here. It came in France a lot faster for some different reasons and because of a burgeoning, immigrant population. But the moment that hits an uptick here, it's going to be a big deal. I promise you it will be a big deal. Because I don't know where we're going to fall on it. I hope we fall on the side of what we're supposed to be.
It's already come up some.
Yeah.
Women in hijabs going through airport security.
Oh, yeah. I get poked in the head at airport security, too, by the way. That's because I have a lot of hair. They poke my hair, too. I got TSA pre-check now. Nobody touches my hair anymore. But it used to be, can we just tick your hair a little bit? So I can't imagine what they're doing to people who job. Yeah. Yeah, it's already here.
Well,
it's here at the DMV.
And I've heard of them making Sikhs take their turban off.
Oh, yeah.
Like, unbelievably shameful.
Yeah, or even, I do expert witness things sometimes. I've worked on cases where people have say they don't wear pants and they have to wear dresses, and that's a religious restraint, and people have said, no, we want to fire them. And they win their cases, the EEOC. So, yeah, it's complicated. I'm not trying to make this easy. Yeah.
I could have just a basic question.
Sure.
That probably a lot of you all can answer, but I was reading an article after the Charlie Hebdo attack, which was totally a mistake because all of them were really opinionated. But there was, I don't remember what website it was on, but he was saying that it says nothing in the Quran about not depicting Muhammad, that the Taliban created that whole.
It's not exactly true.
Yeah,
and I'm not the Islamist, so I couldn't tell you the whole technical thing.
Okay, well that was just my question, if that was created by the Taliban or not.
No,
it's been around longer.
No, it's a longer arc, a longer historical arc. And in the beginning, that wasn't the case, but it changes over time. But it's not about the Taliban. So that's bad. See, but this is what I mean. You read that and you think, it's the Taliban.
And well, I was studying abroad in Morocco, and there was no artwork anywhere, so I kind of really didn't think that it had to do with the Taliban. Yeah,
it's much older. It's much older. And certain sort of sects of Islam too. Beforehand, there's pictures that if you go, you probably have it in the library here. My colleague's book, Jamal Elias, he talks about that. There's depictions of Muhammad. They're just a lot earlier, maybe like 12th, 13th century. Because after a point, you don't do it anymore. Nothing. Yeah, so that's wrong. But that's okay. There's a lot of bad stuff out there on the internet. There's good stuff too. Any questions? Any more? Y'all just want to eat cookies. Yes, Lynn in the back. Lynn could ask me questions all the time. Yeah.
So I was just thinking about the covers that you had of Time magazine and how, in the 50s that would have been the place where conversation was taken.
Yeah.
And would have been extended into the public. And so now in the social media age, where are the conversations?
Oh, that's a good question. World That Daily. I'm sorry. If you don't know what that is, it's like a real right-wing publication. But no, I mean, if we're going to talk about mainstream, where does this conversation happen? Slate, Daily Beast, The Atlantic. You know, Ta-Nehisi has been writing some really good stuff. It happens in Ross Douthat's op-ed page, but he's a conservative writer for the New York Times, op-ed person. It happens, and if you read his blog and all that, there's been some real fiery back and forth in that whole thing. I mean, I'd like to think it happens where I write for Religion Dispatches some, but people are starting to, the other part is that the conversation is getting stinted because the comments get so bad that people are closing up the comments page. So that's not even happening anymore. You know, it's also happening in places, this is a funny thing to say, but it's happening in places like Reddit, believe it or not. This is where, you know, a lot of the Charlie Hebdo stuff, people were talking on Reddit back and forth. And I think that's a really, it's almost sort of an archaic thing if you think about, you've been on the internet as long as I have. Reddit looks great because it reminds you of the 90s, you feel young. I really feel young when I read Reddit. But it's also a good place to have a thread of a conversation. Right? So I think it's in these popular kinds of things. Or I'll give you a stupid example, a conversation about religion that happened on Sunday night. And I talked to some people about this, so you might have heard this. Whitney Houston singing Precious Lord on Sunday night at the Grammys. That was a huge religious conversation that happened on Twitter. Because for church people, that is a sacred classic song. And you don't come out and sing it in a see-through dress. You know, and you don't put out a little 8-minute documentary saying, I'm trying to help black men. We're like, your voice is terrible. You can't do this. Don't do this. You know, and so it was sort of like, can she sing gospel or can she not? Now that was kind of a sort of a pseudo-religious conversation, but it was, people were asking the question, should she have even sung that song on the Grammys? And that's kind of one of those classic things. So sometimes there's this moment where things like kind of pop out and people can have a religious conversation. You know, when the president said what he did, that was a big conversation. People started talking about the Crusades a lot. There were so many threads about the Crusades on Twitter. I was just like, I can't believe this, that people are actually doing this. If the History Channel had run all their Knights Templar stuff that whole weekend, they would have had like so many people watching. I don't know why they just said, we're going to interrupt normal programming and we're about to show the Crusades for the entire weekend. That would have been, they would have had like really high ratings. Okay? So I think those are the things, you know, it's like when things happen, there's a conversation. So when Charlie Hebdo happened, when the Boko Haram happened, when the girls got kidnapped, there's these moments that you can have a conversation, but then it all goes down again until the next drastic thing that happens.
So that would seem like then that what religious studies scholars like you would need to do is be responsive to those, to be ready to
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And to recognize that those are very predictable.
Yeah, they're not predictable.
20 years ago, you could have expected, oh, there's going to be a television special because it's Easter.
Yeah, and that's the moment everybody's going to call me, you know, because it's Easter and they're trying to figure something out. But now it's not like that anymore. It's like, I don't know when it's going to happen. You know, and it happens in these strange moments. Oh, so can I tell a story about this, about a strange moment? So the strangest moment for me, I think, doing this has not been being on TV. It was when the Pope resigned. That was a huge moment. Nobody understood what that moment was. But for me, that was like, it's trifecta moment. Because I got a Pope I don't really like too much resigning. And I didn't say that out loud. You know, he's difficult in different ways, but he did the most right thing he could have ever done. And I will always admire him for it. But when that happened, I got called at 6:10 in the morning. The Pope has resigned. It was Fox 29 News. Can you get here at 7 o'clock? I'm like, no, I'm in my pajamas. And then, can we put you on the phone at 7 and you could be here at 8? I'm like, okay. So, you know, at 7 o'clock, I'm on the phone. I'm trying to get, like, you know, clothes together and stuff. And I'm calling my friends, and I'm like, what just happened here? And so I had to go, like, do, you know, a crash refresher course on myself. I got to remember who the last Pope was that resigned in 14, whatever it was, you know, and why he did it. You know, I had to start reading all of these things. I mean, I had to get up to speed, like, in no time. And basically, it was almost nonstop. Almost every day I was doing something until the election of Francis. And then we were still doing stuff. So it was this kind of weird moment that for like a month and a half, it was nothing but Catholic church all the time. And it was really weird. But it was really great because it was a moment you could do things. So what I did to sort of do the teaching moment was one night I said, it was like 2 nights afterwards, I said, okay, at 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, I'm going to tweet about what just happened here and what the historical antecedents were for this. And so you could understand it. So I did like a series of 30 or 40 tweets. Somebody storyfied it. And that was the way I ended up being on Chris Hayes for an hour. That was when he was still on Saturdays. And he had a whole panel talking about the Catholic Church. That never happens. That was amazing. But that was a moment you could get in and have a longer conversation about something. That was a big deal. And when he comes to Philadelphia, I imagine that I'm gonna be insane and that will happen all over again. But it's those moments where you have to be ready and know what, at least be able to have some basics of what to say. And it's helpful. You had your hand up.
Can you share with us the piece of Sarah Palin with this conversation?
Oh, about Sarah Palin?
There was something about that.
Oh, the media thing. Yeah, I can talk about that because actually that was a moment in which media turned on a different kind of way. So when she was picked, nobody understood what Pentecostalism was. And this was a moment that they all had to say, who can we talk to? Because she goes to this church, but then these stories started coming out of Wasilla. She goes to this, she says she goes to this church, but she was really raised Assemblies of God. And so people wanted to know about speaking in tongues, all of this stuff. And so I did a piece. I got interviewed by somebody in Salon who's still my friend today, Sarah Posner, who was doing a whole thing on Sarah Palin, and it went in Salon, and all these people started reading it. And I got called by ABC News. We want to do a thing on Sarah Palin and her faith. Can you come out? Can we come out and film you? And I was in Rochester, New York at the time, and they were like, let's do this. And it ended up being this 5-minute thing about Pentecostalism. But she was a catalyst in a way for people to talk about Pentecostalism, because if they had been elected, that would have been the first time they had a Pentecostal in that high of an office. Before that, the biggest Pentecostal they ever had in kind of a governmental office was John Ashcroft, who was Assemblies of God and was the Attorney General. So it was a very interesting moment, and the ways in which religion has played in her story have been very interesting too. But that media piece at the beginning, where they tried to understand it because it was like the hot thing, it got dropped within a month. And then they missed a whole bunch of other things that were going on underneath that were really important that they should have been paying attention to. But everybody started paying attention to the whole kind of, it was going down in the tank after the money thing happened. So that changed everything. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm not the idea of education, high school education is interesting.
It'd be hard to do.
Yeah, is that happening anywhere?
Private schools. I'm thinking about the conversation we had last night about, them changing the textbooks. This is the other part that I didn't talk about that's really difficult right now, at least in the United States, is that there's a whole history that's being changed about religion in America and about the founders and everything else. You wouldn't know that Benjamin Franklin and all of them were deists. If you read David Barton's stuff, you'd think that everybody was a Christian and, they came and they planted a cross at Plymouth Rock, instead of everything else. It's very difficult now. And this is part of it, is that people are getting these histories that are, I would say, altered for a certain kind of either religious or political reasons. And so by the time people get to me in college, for the most part, I don't have people yet at Penn who have been really upset when they found out something that they thought was something else, But I do think that if this does happen and we can start to, have some kind of and not so much a religious education, because the word religious education automatically makes people think that you're trying to indoctrinate them, but to just learn about world religions as a part of history, I think would be very useful. Even if you do it on that, but if you take it out of just contemporary stuff and say, here's the world's major religions, here's how they got started, here's what they believe, just so you have this working knowledge, that would be good enough. Because a lot of people don't have that. And so I would advocate for that. I think that, to me, that's not dangerous, but to a lot of people, that's very dangerous. And therein lies the problem, because I'm not making the textbooks and I'm not buying them. They are, and they're picking them out. So, there you go. Yeah?
I've got a question for you. You mentioned the living versus the theoretical.
Mm-hmm.
Getting involved in the conversation. I was wondering how you feel, or if you feel this is an important part of it. The public, I guess, in the public popular audiences, we're often led to believe that we've got these traditions that exist in some sort of pure or ideal or original state.
Mm-hmm.
And we're getting this a lot right now. We have ever since prayers,
Yeah.
especially. So I wonder how you feel that fits into the conversation, addressing what's really a misunderstanding.
Yeah, it's always really hard. I'm thinking I'm going to talk about a friend of mine. So if you want to go buy a book, I'm going to sell somebody else's book tonight. Peter Manseau has this book out, No Gods But Other Gods or something like that. It's kind of, just look up his last name. It's really easy. But he's talking about this history, the beginning history of America and all the other faiths besides Christianity that are here. And people are here very early, and they're doing lots of different things other than Christianity. And so that is a narrative that needs to be dismantled. He just had a really good piece this week in the New York Times about early Islam in the Republic. And I thought, this is great. This is exactly what people need to read, because it dismantles this narrative about Christian nation, blah, blah, blah. There's a reason why the framers wanted to do what they did. They wanted religious freedom for themselves. They wanted it for other people, too. And so other people came. But it's a lot of investment for people to hold on to the myth, right? Because if you don't hold on to that myth, it cracks up something about you. So even when the president says, slavery and Jim Crow are Christian things, they're like, what are you talking about? Christians didn't do anything in slavery. And I'm showing my students all these pictures this week about lynching and everything in my American Jesus course, and then they have to come to grips with that history. And that's really different. And so it's really hard because people are invested in these things. It's not just a nationwide investment or a nationalism investment. It's an investment in who they are, how they see themselves in their narrative. And so I think you have to try to do it with care, first of all, so that people don't lose their minds, because people have lost their minds before with stuff like this. They end up shooting up places, sadly. And then second, it needs to be a process. And I'm just trying to think about, and I'm hoping that you all can think with me about ways to do that process. I don't know that this generation of religious studies scholars will be able to figure it all out. I hope the next generation will do better than we do. At least that's what I'd like to think anyway. Yeah?
Have you ever had this kind of dialogue with Chris Hayes?
Yeah, I have.
I mean, that's
yeah. But Chris is interesting. His dad was going to be a Jesuit priest, and he jumped out. So Chris is already, tuned. He's not religious, but he's very interested. And so, yeah. I mean, there's, people, it's really surprising. You'd be surprised about how many people are interested in the media. What I find at Fox, when I did Fox a few times before I didn't do Fox anymore, and there's lots of reasons why. They like to talk about me when things go bad. They want to talk about it in certain kinds of ways, and that openness isn't there. And not and I'm not going to say that everybody on MSNBC is that open either, but I've had good conversations with him, yeah, and that's why he can do those, there's certain people you can look at on all of these shows that will bring the religion people on for certain reasons, and they do it, and I've done stuff for CNN before too, and it's been really great, but it's been more domestic kinds of things that have been interesting, yeah. Anybody else? Are we done? Okay. Thank you all. Thanks for being a great audience.